The mansion seemed to breathe with an air of perfection. Every corner meticulously crafted, every inch polished to a gleaming shine. But beneath the polished surface, there was an undercurrent of unease, a tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Elena Clark had only been here a few weeks, yet she had already sensed it. The cold, unspoken distance between Richard Davenport and his wife, Sophia, with her flawless beauty and grace, never left the mansion. Elena had noticed the way the woman moved through the grand hallways with a quiet, almost haunting air, always covered in elegant dresses that masked more than just her skin. The rare moments when their paths crossed, Elena would catch glimpses of something in Sophia's eyes, something heavy, like a burden she couldn't shake. The sort of look that made Elena wonder about the true nature of this gilded cage they all lived in. Then, one afternoon, as Elena was dusting the grand piano in the living room, she caught sight of something that stopped her heart. A fleeting shadow in the hallway. Sophia had lowered her dress just enough to reveal the barest trace of something dark beneath her skin. The faintest line, a bruise, a mark. It didn't make sense. But then again, nothing in this mansion did. There were whispers among the staff, quiet rumors that spoke of things unsaid, things Elena hadn't dared to question until now. This was no ordinary household. And now, she was no longer just an observer. Elena's hands trembled as she wiped the silverware, her mind racing. This was more than just a job now. She had to find out the truth. And she had to do it before it was too late. 03 Mini High. Jonathan, the head butler, entered the kitchen, his presence immediately commanding attention. Everything must be impeccable, he reminded the staff, his sharp gaze sweeping the room. Mr. Davenport expects nothing less than perfection. Elena nodded, her determination to prove her worth swelling within her. She turned to her sister, Hannah, who had been employed at the villa longer than she had. Have you ever served Mr. Davenport personally? She asked, curiosity getting the better of her. Hannah nodded, and Jonathan, overhearing their conversation, interjected, everyone here has the opportunity to serve Mr. Davenport directly, he said, his voice smooth but authoritative. He believes in rotating staff to ensure everyone is capable of meeting his standards. Elena's eyes widened with excitement. I've heard so many wonderful things about him, she said, her admiration evident. I hope one day I get the chance to serve him personally. It would be such an honor. Jonathan's expression softened slightly, as if he'd seen too much over the years to be easily impressed. Mr. Davenport is a good man, he said, his tone carrying the weight of his extensive experience. He has high standards and expects excellence. But he's fair and generous when a job is done well. Elena nodded, taking in his words, knowing that they held more meaning than a simple compliment. Just then, Jonathan surprised her with an unexpected task. Elena, if you're willing, you can handle the breakfast service today. Her heart skipped a beat. Really? Are you sure? Jonathan nodded with confidence. You're ready. Just remember everything you've learned in the past 2 weeks. Marco, who had been listening in, added, Mr. and Mrs. Davenport's breakfast is already prepared. Just remember to knock twice before entering the room. But don't keep them waiting. Mr. Davenport doesn't like to be kept waiting. Elena carefully placed the tray on the table, her hands trembling slightly as she took it from Marco. Hannah offered her a quick smile and a thumbs up before she left the kitchen, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on her shoulders. Elena made her way up the grand staircase to the master bedroom, her nerves a mix of excitement and apprehension. Outside the door, she took a deep breath. Steadying herself, she knocked twice, as instructed, and gently opened the door. But as she entered, she froze. Mr. Davenport was standing in the doorway of the bathroom, fully dressed, his presence commanding and tense. From behind the open door, Elena could hear snippets of a heated argument, shouted words that bounced off the marble walls. Get a hold of yourself for once. Mr. Davenport's voice was sharp. These are important guests, and I can't have you embarrassing me in front of them. Elena's cheeks burned with the sudden embarrassment of witnessing such a private moment. She quickly placed the breakfast tray on the table, intent on slipping away unnoticed. But Mr. Davenport's voice halted her. Wait, he commanded, his tone stern but composed. Elena turned, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with dread. Mr. Davenport shouted toward the bathroom, Stay here and be quiet. Before turning back to her, he took a step closer. his expression softening just slightly as he addressed her. "Everything is prepared downstairs for our guests?" Elena nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. The lounge has been prepared as you requested. And the kitchen is preparing the main courses for the late breakfast. The canapés and desserts are ready. We've been busy since early this morning to ensure everything is perfect." Mr. Davenport studied her for a moment, his eyes piercing. He nodded. "Very well. I'll accompany you to inspect everything myself." As they left the room, Elena felt both the thrill and weight of the moment. She was about to give Richard Davenport himself a private tour. This was the man she had admired from afar. Now standing so close, scrutinizing her every move, but the tension from the argument she had overheard hung heavy in the air. A reminder that even the lives of the rich and successful were fraught with complications. Elena's pulse quickened as they moved through the mansion. She led him from the living room, where fresh flowers sat on polished tables, to the drawing room where the meeting would take place. She watched closely as he examined every detail, chairs arranged just so, notebooks and pens perfectly placed. His nod of approval sent a wave of pride through her. Their final stop was the kitchen, where Marco was finalizing the late breakfast menu. The air was filled with the rich aromas of freshly cooked food as Marco detailed each dish to Mr. Davenport. "This is a twist on the classic Eggs Benedict," Marco explained, presenting a dish elegantly plated with prosciutto in place of the usual Canadian bacon. A touch of truffle in the hollandaise sauce. Mr. Davenport sampled a few bites, his face betraying nothing. After a moment, he nodded approvingly. "Marco, your creativity never disappoints. Remember, we begin plating only after the guests arrive. We want everything to be fresh and at the perfect temperature." As they exited the kitchen, Mr. Davenport turned to Elena. "Thank you. Everything appears to be in order." He paused, his eyes scanning her face before settling on her uniform. "You're new here, aren't you? I don't recall seeing you before." Elena swallowed her nerves and nodded. "Yes, sir. This is my 3rd week. I started 2 weeks ago." Mr. Davenport's eyes traced the sharp lines of her pressed uniform, his gaze thoughtful. "You've done well. Keep up the good work. And you'll do just fine here." Her chest swelled with pride at his praise. "Thank you, sir. I'm honored to work here." At that moment, Mrs. Davenport emerged from the hallway, resplendent in a silk gown that shimmered under the soft light. Elena couldn't help but admire her beauty, feeling a pang of envy at the seemingly perfect life she led. Mr. Davenport's demeanor shifted immediately. His eyes softened, and he smiled warmly as he draped an arm around his wife's waist. Pulling her close, "You look stunning," he said, kissing her cheek. "You'll make quite the impression on our guests." Elena's heart beat a little faster as she watched their interaction. There was something unsettling in the way they were so perfectly poised yet so distant. As if their polished lives concealed deeper, darker currents beneath the surface. But as Elena watched, she noticed something unusual about Mrs. Davenport's reaction. There was a slight flinch when her husband touched her, a subtle tension in her shoulders that didn't quite match the affectionate gesture. Elena's brow furrowed, but she quickly brushed it off, assuming it was lingering awkwardness from their earlier argument. "If there's nothing else, I'll return to my duties," Elena said, preparing to excuse herself from the scene. Mr. Davenport nodded, his attention still focused entirely on his wife. He kissed her cheek once more, inhaling deeply as if savoring her perfume. "You smell divine," he murmured, his voice soft but possessive. Mrs. Davenport didn't respond verbally, but Elena noticed her smile never quite reached her eyes. The moment was strangely bittersweet. Elena couldn't help but think how even the wealthiest of couples had their tense moments. But she was sure that with time, the day would smooth over. As she walked away, her eyes fell to the time on her watch, 10 a.m. The guests would be arriving any minute now. She overheard Mrs. Davenport's soft voice as she spoke to her husband. "I'll wait in the vestibule and greet the guests," she said, gently extricating herself from Mr. Davenport's arm and moving toward the grand front door. The change in Mr. Davenport's demeanor was immediate, his response as quick as it was startling. His voice, low and firm, carried a weight that caused Elena to freeze mid-step. "You know the rules," he said sharply, his words biting through the otherwise peaceful atmosphere. "You are not to try to leave the house." Mrs. Davenport gave a small nod. her face unreadable as she silently retreated to the sofa in the drawing room. Elena, still standing there, felt a strange chill settle over the moment. Mr. Davenport's gaze shifted to her, his sharp eyes catching hers. "It's inappropriate to linger and observe," he said, his voice losing none of its authority. "Go to the front hall and wait to greet the guests instead." Ashamed at being caught eavesdropping, Elena quickly lowered her gaze and bowed her head deeply. "I apologize, sir," she muttered, hurrying away as the unsettling weight of the moment settled heavily on her shoulders. As Elena made her way to the great hall, her mind raced with thoughts of the exchange she had just witnessed. Mr. Davenport's words, "You know the rules. You are not to try to leave the house," replayed in her head, each repetition adding another layer of confusion. It sounded almost controlling, a chilling command that seemed out of place in the polished world she had entered. Elena tried to rationalize it, wondering if Mrs. Davenport was ill or if there was another, more pressing reason for such a strict rule. When Elena reached the great hall, she straightened herself by the door, trying to regain her composure. She observed Hannah and the other maids setting up a table with an assortment of canapés and welcome drinks. The tension in the air was palpable, as everyone prepared for the arrival of the important guests. Soon, the unmistakable sound of luxury cars driving up the winding driveway shattered the silence. 3 sleek vehicles glided to a halt in front of the mansion, the engines purring softly before cutting off. Elena took a deep breath, reminding herself of the proper procedure for welcoming guests. She quickly adjusted her posture, ensuring her smile was warm and professional. As the car doors opened, Elena stepped forward with a bright, welcoming expression. "Welcome to the Davenport mansion," she said, her voice steady, motioning for the guests to enter. Mr. and Mrs. Davenport emerged from the vestibule, their earlier tension masked by the polished smiles they exchanged with their guests. The contrast between their forced pleasantries and the underlying discord was almost palpable. As Mr. Davenport shook hands with a guest, one of them exclaimed, "Richard, my old friend, this place is even more magnificent than I remember." "You're too kind, Charles," Mr. Davenport replied smoothly, his voice warm and practiced. "Sophia and I are delighted to have you all here." As the guests moved toward the drawing room, Elena couldn't help but notice Mrs. Davenport's rigid posture. She seemed uncomfortable, her smile tight, eyes distant. Every now and then, Mr. Davenport would lean in and whisper something in her ear. Mrs. Davenport would give a small nod, her expression unreadable. Once the guests were settled in the drawing room, Elena, Jonathan, and Hannah began serving the refreshments. The atmosphere in the room was relaxed, filled with polite conversation and laughter. But Elena couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that lingered in the air. As she approached Mrs. Davenport to place a plate in front of her, the woman raised a hand slightly, catching her attention. "I'm sorry," Mrs. Davenport said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Could you bring some coffee for the table and make me a double espresso, please?" Elena nodded, acknowledging the request. It struck her as odd since fresh, chilled drinks had already been served. But she quickly turned and headed toward the kitchen, eager to fulfill the request. As she made her way to Marco, the weight of the morning's events seemed to follow her, leaving her with more questions than answers about the lives of the people she served. 03 Mini High. Returning with a tray of steaming coffee cups, Elena made sure to serve Mrs. Davenport last, carefully preparing her cup with the requested double shot of espresso. As she placed the dark liquid in front of her, she caught a fleeting glimpse of gratitude in Mrs. Davenport's eyes, a silent acknowledgement that was quickly masked by her usual composure. With breakfast underway, Elena and Hannah stationed themselves just outside the drawing room door. The sounds of laughter and relaxed conversation filled the air, accompanied by polite compliments about the food. Elena leaned closer to Hannah, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know why Mrs. Davenport isn't allowed to leave the house?" "It's so strange." Hannah shrugged nonchalantly. "It's always been that way. I think it's just their marriage arrangement. You know, rich people have their own quirks. It's not like." Elena sighed, relief washing over her. "I'm not the only one who finds it odd." Lowering her voice even further, she asked, "Does anyone know why?" Hannah shrugged again, her tone casual. "Not really. It's been this way since she arrived. Mr. Davenport is very protective of her. When she does go out, there's always a team of bodyguards surrounding her, keeping her in a tight circle. But even the First Lady doesn't stay in house all the time. Elena frowned, her curiosity deepening. Hannah's admission didn't make things clearer. But at least it wasn't just her who found the situation unsettling. Mr. Davenport gives her everything she could want: designer clothes, jewelry, trips to their other properties, but without asking for anything in return. Hannah continued, her voice a bit wistful. It's a strange kind of life, I guess. Elena's thoughts lingered on the idea of having everything but still being confined. Without needing anything, Hannah had said. The words echoed in Elena's mind. Was it really such a luxury to need nothing? To be kept within the confines of these walls? Before she could dwell on it further, a sudden commotion from inside the drawing room caught her attention. Chairs scraping, raised voices, a heated exchange. Hannah, what's going on in there? Should we check? Elena asked, her concern mounting. I don't know, but no, we shouldn't barge in unless we're called. Hannah replied. Her tone was firm, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Just then, a voice rang out from inside the drawing room. Maids. We need assistance. Elena exchanged a worried look with Hannah before quickly opening the door and stepping inside. The scene before them was chaotic. Mrs. Davenport was standing by the sofa, ashen-faced and trembling, her hand pressed to her forehead in an attempt to steady herself. Mrs. Davenport says, her voice barely audible, could you please escort me to my rooms? Mr. Davenport's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure in front of the guests. Of course, darling, go and rest. We'll talk later, he said, but his eyes told a different story. They followed his wife with a look that was far colder than his words. As Elena stepped forward, taking on the role of escorting Mrs. Davenport out of the room, she couldn't help but feel the oppressive weight of the tension left behind. She closed the door behind them, but it was impossible to ignore the angry glare Mr. Davenport had shot in their direction. Elena wondered if the other guests had noticed it too. As they made their way toward the grand staircase, Elena felt a growing unease. There was something deeply wrong in the atmosphere of the mansion, something off about the woman she was assisting. Mrs. Davenport's unsteady footsteps only amplified the feeling, and Elena instinctively reached out to steady her elbow. You don't have to follow me upstairs, Mrs. Davenport murmured softly, her voice neutral, though there was something Elena couldn't quite place. I can manage. Elena hesitated, torn between her professional duty and a growing sense of concern. It's my duty to care for everyone in the household. Ma'am, she said gently, her voice low, including you. I want to make sure you're all right. They reached the top of the stairs, and Mrs. Davenport paused, gripping the banister with trembling fingers. For a fleeting moment, Elena thought she saw a flash of weakness in the woman's eyes before it was quickly concealed. The mask was back in place, but the moment of vulnerability hadn't escaped Elena's notice. They continued down the hallway toward the master bedroom. Mrs. Davenport's hand shook as she reached for the doorknob. Thank you, Elena, she said softly, her voice steady but faint. You can go now. I just need to rest. Elena curtsied respectfully, but she didn't move. If you like, I can wait outside your door in case you need anything. The other staff are busy downstairs, and nobody will hear you if you call for support. Mrs. Davenport shook her head, her face a picture of weary resolve. No, that won't be necessary, she said, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of something deeper. I just want some privacy. But as she spoke, Elena noticed the telltale sign of tears welling in her eyes. It was enough to break through Elena's professional demeanor. A pang of sympathy tugging at her heart. She knew it wasn't her place to get involved, she was overstepping. Perhaps, but she couldn't bring herself to leave Mrs. Davenport in this state. Mrs. Davenport, Elena said gently, her voice barely a whisper. Are you really okay? The question hung in the air for a long, pregnant moment, its weight palpable. Then, like a dam bursting, Mrs. Davenport's composure shattered. She shook her head, her face crumpling, and tears spilled freely down her cheeks. Without thinking, Elena reached forward and gently closed the bedroom door behind them, shutting out the rest of the world. Mrs. Davenport collapsed onto the edge of the bed, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Elena sat beside her, close enough to offer comfort but careful not to invade her space. I'm here if you need to talk, Elena said softly, and I promise, I can be discreet. Mrs. Davenport looked up, her eyes swollen and red. May I hug you? She asked. Her voice small and fragile. I just need a shoulder. Surprised, but deeply moved, Elena nodded. Mrs. Davenport leaned into the embrace, her arms wrapping around Elena's waist as she buried her face in her shoulder. The sobs that followed were louder, more desperate, as years of repressed emotion poured out in waves. Elena's mind raced, wondering what had happened between Mrs. Davenport and her husband to cause so much pain. Was it tied to their earlier argument? Or was there something deeper lurking beneath the surface? After a few minutes, Mrs. Davenport's sobs began to subside. She pulled back, sniffling and wiping her eyes. Oh, dear, she murmured, trying to compose herself. I'm so sorry for messing up your dress, she said, glancing down at Elena's uniform. Elena smiled softly and waved her hand dismissively. No, don't worry about my uniform. Ma'am, it's okay. As she glanced down at Mrs. Davenport's gown, she noticed a tear-stained streak across the fabric, just above the foundation. Do you want me to get you a new one, ma'am? She asked gently. Mrs. Davenport nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, please, the white one with the similar neck strap. It's in the walk-in closet. 03 mini high. Elena got up and moved toward the expansive closet, her fingers brushing through rows of designer gowns. As she surveyed through the luxurious fabric, she couldn't help but notice a recurring theme: a single-shaped high-neck or collared dress. It seemed an odd fashion choice for someone living in such a warm climate. She couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't quite right. Finding the requested gown, she handed it over to Mrs. Davenport. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Elena saw a flash of fear followed by what seemed like gratitude flicker across Mrs. Davenport's face. Thank you, Mrs. Davenport said quietly. Could I trouble you to wait here a bit longer? I need you to take this dress to the laundry immediately. The tear stains and makeup need to be treated before they set. Elena nodded, watching Mrs. Davenport disappear into the ensuite. As she stood there, her gaze scanned the room. The luxurious furnishings, once a symbol of wealth and comfort, now seemed cold and soulless. The room, filled with expensive items and artwork, felt hollow. When Mrs. Davenport emerged from the bathroom, changed and looking more composed, she handed Elena the stained gown. Their fingers brushed briefly, and then Mrs. Davenport grasped Elena's hand for a moment longer than necessary. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. For being here, for letting me cry. I'm sorry you had to witness me like that. Elena squeezed her hand gently. There's no need to apologize. Ma'am, everyone has their moments of weakness. Mrs. Davenport pulled Elena into another hug. Elena could feel a wave of protectiveness rising within her. But as they embraced, the collar of Mrs. Davenport's dress shifted slightly, revealing something that made Elena's blood run cold. On the pale skin of Mrs. Davenport's neck was a tattoo, a barcode. Not just any tattoo, but a barcode. Elena's mind reeled as she stared at the barcode tattoo on Mrs. Davenport's neck. Her professional composure cracked, and she instinctively pulled away from the hug, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. Is something wrong? Mrs. Davenport asked, her voice tinged with worry. Elena struggled to regain her voice. I'm sorry, ma'am, but, what is that? She was barely able to keep her professional demeanor intact. Why are you hiding it? I've noticed how all your dresses cover your neck. The color drained from Mrs. Davenport's face. She took a step back, instinctively bringing a hand to her neck. I think, her voice faltered, and she cleared her throat. I think you need to leave right now. Elena. Her words hung in the air like a heavy threat. Forget what you saw. It's safer for everyone that way. But Elena couldn't let it go. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Mrs. Davenport's constant confinement in the house, her frightened demeanor, the controlled behavior, everything was starting to make sense. And it was terrifying. Ma'am, Elena said urgently, if you're in danger, you need to tell me. I've seen how scared and unhappy you've been today. I want to help. Mrs. Davenport's eyes darted quickly toward the door, as if expecting Mr. Davenport to burst in at any moment. You don't know anything about my husband, she said, her voice trembling, and you don't want to know who he really is. It's better if you don't find out. It's safer that way. A chill ran down Elena's spine as she heard her words. What do you mean? Who is he really? Mrs. Davenport shook her head frantically. Please, Elena, she whispered, her eyes darting to the name tag on Elena's uniform. Promise me you won't tell anyone about the tattoo. If anyone finds out, it won't just be me in danger. You and everyone else who knows will be in terrible trouble." Elena was struggling to process the gravity of what she was hearing. But she nodded seriously. "I promise, ma'am, but let me help you. If you ever need anything, you don't have to face this alone." Before Mrs. Davenport could respond, the door to the bedroom opened, and Mr. Davenport stood in the doorway, his expression ominous. "The guests have left early," he said, his voice cold. He turned his gaze toward Elena. "You may go. Tend to the gardens or something." Elena hesitated, looking back at Mrs. Davenport. The fear in the woman's eyes was unmistakable. Mr. Davenport repeated the order in a tone that left no room for discussion. "You may go, Elena, now." Elena had no choice but to comply. As she stepped out of the room, she exchanged a final, meaningful look with Mrs. Davenport. Silently promising that this wasn't the end, she walked down the hallway, her instincts telling her to stay close, to be nearby in case Mrs. Davenport needed her. But as she lingered near the door, she heard Mr. Davenport's voice again. "I told you to leave," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Don't linger here. We don't need anything else. The guests have left, and the drawing room needs cleaning." Elena nodded, her heart pounding as she walked down the stairs. She glanced over her shoulder one last time before continuing, only to see Mr. Davenport still watching her from the threshold. The intensity of his gaze sent a shiver down her spine. When she reached the ground floor, Elena's mind was racing a whirlwind of thoughts and fear. She headed to the kitchen, where the other staff were busy cleaning. As she entered, Hannah approached her, concern etched on her face. "Elena, what's going on? You look pale," Hannah said, gently touching her arm. Elena hesitated, recalling her promise to Mrs. Davenport. "Hannah," she said quietly, "have you ever noticed anything strange about Mr. Davenport?" Hannah frowned. "No, not really. He's always been kind and polite, especially compared to some of the wealthy people I've worked for." Marco, the chef, overheard their conversation as he passed by. "Mr. Davenport is a saint, if you ask me," he said with a casual shrug. "He's a very patient man, especially considering his wife's fragile nature." Elena's fury flared at his words. "Fragile? What do you mean by fragile?" she asked, her voice tense. Marco shrugged. "Well, I've been their private chef for several years. I've seen Mrs. Davenport cry over the smallest of things. Honestly, I could count how lucky she is to be his wife. If you ask me, if she worked in the kitchen or had any of those attitudes, she'd be useless." Elena bit her tongue, fighting the urge to defend Mrs. Davenport. But she remembered her promise. "Why do you ask about Mrs. Davenport?" Marco added, his tone growing suspicious. Elena quickly shook her head, trying to appear indifferent. "No real reason. I've just admired Mr. Davenport for a long time." Marco nodded, seemingly satisfied, but then added, "Because of that incident from before? The first time you saw Mrs. Davenport cry, right? Trust me, it happens all the time. She's just a sensitive soul. Don't worry about it. I've worked here for years, and I've never seen her mistreated." Hannah nodded in agreement, but Elena remained unconvinced. Before she could say more, Jonathan, the head butler, appeared in the doorway. "Enough with the small talk," he said sternly. "Back to work. We need this place ready before Mr. Davenport returns." Elena nodded, her mind racing. There was something dark happening with Mr. Davenport. Something far beyond a simple marital dispute. The barcode tattoo had to mean something. She couldn't stop now, not when she was so close to the truth. Elena's mind raced as she pondered the secret she now carried: Mrs. Davenport's fear of her husband, the controlled behavior, and the darkness lurking beneath the surface. She hadn't chosen to be caught up in this, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was the only one who could help. As she continued her work, scrubbing surfaces with mechanical precision, her thoughts were consumed by the mystery of the barcode tattoo on Mrs. Davenport's neck, and how it tied into the strange and oppressive life the woman led. The day passed in eerie calm, as though the earlier events had been nothing more than a fleeting nightmare. Elena went about her tasks, but her mind was never far from Mrs. Davenport's plight. As the afternoon wore on, Elena found herself in the living room, dusting the ornate shelves filled with leather-bound books and expensive trinkets. She heard footsteps approaching and turned to see Mr. Davenport entering the room, his face a mask of controlled tension. Everyone, he called, his voice echoing through the spacious mansion. Gather here, immediately. Elena quickly adjusted her uniform, trying to look calm, though her heart was pounding in her chest. The other staff members began filing into the room. Hannah appeared by her side, casting her a questioning look. Marco, the chef, wiped his hands on his apron as he entered, followed by Jonathan, the butler, his usual stern expression tinged with curiosity. The staff formed a semicircle around Mr. Davenport, and an uneasy silence settled over the room. Mr. Davenport's sharp eyes scanned the assembled staff, assessing them with a gaze that felt like it could pierce through to their very souls. I have an important announcement, he began, his voice low and controlled. Mrs. Davenport is currently unwell and resting in our bedroom. Under no circumstances is anyone to enter her room or disturb her. Is that clear? A chorus of, yes, sir, echoed through the room. But Elena felt her heart race as she tried to maintain a calm exterior. She knew the truth behind Mrs. Davenport's illness, and she was acutely aware of Mr. Davenport's penetrating gaze as it swept across each staff member. Mr. Davenport continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. Anyone found in non-compliance will face immediate termination. A chill ran through the room at the severity of his words. The staff exchanged concerned looks, but no one dared speak. I will be leaving shortly on urgent business, Mr. Davenport added, adjusting his expensive watch. I expect everything to be in perfect order upon my return. Jonathan, as head butler, you will be in charge in my absence. Jonathan nodded formally. Of course, sir, you can rely on us. With a final sweeping look at the staff, Mr. Davenport turned on his heel and strode out of the room. The sound of his footsteps faded, followed by the roar of his Ferrari engine as it drove off into the distance. As the staff began to disperse and return to their tasks, Elena remained motionless. Her mind was racing with the implications of Mr. Davenport's orders and the secret she was carrying. The weight of it all pressed heavily on her chest. Hannah, noticing Elena's pale face, walked over to her. Are you okay? You look pale. Elena tried to force a smile, trying to appear normal. I'm fine, just a bit tired. Long day. Hannah wasn't entirely convinced, but she nodded. Well, we should get back to work. You know how Mr. Davenport expects everything to be perfect. As Hannah walked away, Elena's gaze drifted toward the staircase leading upstairs. She thought of Mrs. Davenport alone and possibly harmed, trapped in a room she wasn't allowed to leave. She had made a promise to help, and now she was determined to follow through, no matter the cost. Elena returned to her dusting, but her movements had slowed. The ornate clock on the mantelpiece ticked loudly, each passing second feeling like an eternity. She knew she had to do something, but how could she help Mrs. Davenport without endangering them both? Her thoughts were interrupted when she made a decision. She couldn't stand by and do nothing. With deliberate motions, she finished her cleaning task and made her way toward Jonathan. Jonathan, she said, keeping her voice calm, I was thinking of cleaning out the empty guest room upstairs, opening the windows for ventilation, replacing the flowers, all of that. Jonathan considered her request for a moment before nodding in agreement. Good thinking. Elena, here, take this bucket of fresh flowers with you. They were delivered this morning by the florist. He handed her a beautifully arranged bouquet. And Elena, now with the bucket in hand, made her way toward the staircase. Her heart raced with every step she took, each one feeling heavier than the last. The plush carpet muffled her footsteps, but to her, they sounded like thunder in the quiet house. When she reached the top, she paused, listening for any sounds coming from the master bedroom. Elena's eyes were drawn to the closed door where she knew Mrs. Davenport was being held captive in her own home. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Elena approached the door. She raised her hand to knock but hesitated, remembering Mr. Davenport's harsh warning about disobedience. But the memory of Mrs. Davenport's frightened eyes and the mysterious barcode tattoos steeled Elena's resolve. With trembling fingers, she tapped lightly on the door, her voice gentle as a whisper. Elena spoke. Mrs. Davenport, it's me. Elena, could you please open the door? The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, each passing second making Elena's heart pound harder. Just as she was about to give up, a faint sound reached her ears, the soft click of a lock turning. The door opened slightly, revealing Mrs. Davenport's pale, tear-stained face. Elena, Mrs. Davenport's voice was hoarse, her eyes darting anxiously down the hallway. "You shouldn't be here. If anyone finds out." "I know," Elena replied, her voice small and urgent. "Barely a whisper. But I couldn't stop thinking about you. Are you okay?" Mrs. Davenport hesitated for a long moment, her gaze flicking toward the hallway once more. Then, she opened the door wider, allowing Elena to slip inside. Elena clutched the bucket of flowers tightly, afraid that leaving it outside might draw attention and cause someone to come looking for her. Once the door slammed shut behind them, Elena quickly placed the bucket down beside it. But the sight that met her eyes made her gasp. The usually immaculate room was now in shambles. Shattered glass lay scattered across the floor near the dressing table, and bruises were clearly visible on Mrs. Davenport's arms and legs. The once elegant gown she wore was torn and stained with tears. "Oh my God," Elena gasped, placing the flowers down beside the door. "What happened? Did he do this to you?" Mrs. Davenport nodded feebly, tears welling up in her eyes. She took a faltering step forward, but her legs gave out beneath her. Elena rushed forward to catch her, guiding her gently to the edge of the luxurious king-sized bed. "Oh, Elena," Mrs. Davenport whispered, her voice barely audible. "Tell me what's going on. That tattoo, what is it? I want to help you escape this horror." Mrs. Davenport looked at her, her eyes filled with fear and resignation. "I can't," she whispered, her voice almost drowned by despair. "I'm not willing to leave with him." She paused, swallowing hard, her voice barely a breath. "He owns me. He bought me. I belong to him." Elena's heart clenched at the words, the weight of Mrs. Davenport's confession hanging in the air like a suffocating cloud. The dark truth was starting to take shape, and Elena couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to act, no matter the cost.